Week 2, Overview, Napoleon, the man and his career. Napoleon Bonaparte dominated the first 15 years of 19th century history. Historians date the end of the French Revolution to Napoleon's seizure of power. That's when the French government began the shift from a republic to a dictatorship. Frenchmen at the time probably didn't perceive it that way as it happened. Napoleon gained power by slow steps, and he liked to style himself as a son of the revolution and one of its greatest promoters. Even as he tightened his grasp on ruling power, he continued to promote the ideals and some of the forms of the revolution. So what kind of man was this Napoleon? He was a brilliant general who knew how to wage war. He desired glory, honor, and power. Napoleon was below average height and not particularly handsome, but he was vivacious with a piercing gaze. He worked amazingly hard, often for 20 hours out of every 24, with no signs of fatigue. As a military commander, his decisions were typically based on careful planning and detailed knowledge rather than intuition. What struck his staff as sudden flashes of insight were actually the fruit of painstaking analysis. Napoleon was not a religious man as such. Though he repeatedly expressed confidence in his star or destiny, we have no reason to believe that he had any personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He demonstrated acts of cruelty at times in his career, and his ultimate drive seemed to be one of personal ambition. Napoleon had extraordinary personal gifts, but what did he do with them? He sought the dominion of all Europe. His decisions led to thousands of deaths on the battlefield and in marches between battles. About 570,000 died in the Russian campaign alone. He ended this life under the judgment of men in exile on an island deep in the South Pacific. It's fearful to consider his eternal destiny. How did this man rise to absolute power in France? As one of many military commanders during the French Revolution, Napoleon led an army to Egypt. He escaped near disaster at the hands of Horatio Nelson, who destroyed his fleet and trapped his army on the far side of the Mediterranean. Britain joined with Austria and Russia to oppose revolutionary France, but Russia dropped out of the coalition and Austria was beaten by Napoleon's forces. Britain signed a peace treaty with France in Amiens in 1802. The French Senate, which was by then controlled by Napoleon, declared that the nation owed a signal pledge of gratitude to the first consul for his success in bringing peace to France and Europe. The Senate first thought to extend his consulate for 10 years, but Napoleon took initiative and referred the decision to the people by a plebiscite, a vote of the people for or against a proposal. Thus he became first consul for life, making Napoleon a monarch in all but name. The French Constitution had to be amended, and naturally the powers of the first consul and the Senate were increased, while those of the legislative body and tribunate were diminished. In 1804, using false accusations and complex plots, Napoleon made it seem as if the Bourbon family was threatening his leadership. Those who had much to gain, peasants enjoying nationalized land, merchants and businessmen benefiting from peace and stability, bureaucrats and military men who rose or fell with Napoleon's regime, were all happy to make him Emperor of France. Seeking legitimacy, Napoleon planned a grand coronation in 1804 and persuaded Pope Pius VII to come to Paris to crown him. But when the moment for the coronation came, Napoleon crowned himself instead. When Napoleon became emperor, he established his royalty in a dynastic house, or so he intended it to be. Napoleon now controlled France, but he wanted more. In the struggle for sea power, the author states that Great Britain was the barrier in the path of Napoleon's ambition. England was an obsession for Napoleon. In Napoleon's mind, England was the strongest nation opposing France and the hardest to defeat. Because England had the most powerful navy in the world, the British presented a significant threat to any of Napoleon's plans that involved conquest by sea. Napoleon dreamed of a vast armada that would ferry countless French soldiers across the English Channel in a whole new conquest of Britain. One British naval hero, Horatio Nelson, symbolizes England's successful opposition to France at sea. Nelson was a British naval commander who was famous for his victories during the Napoleonic Wars and his dedication to his men and to his duty. At the Battle of the Nile, Nelson successfully defeated the French fleet at Aboukir in the Mediterranean, which left the French army stranded in Egypt. At the Battle of Copenhagen, Nelson crushed the strong Danish fleet, which had joined Russia and Sweden in an armed neutrality to secure their trade with France. The Battle of Trafalgar is considered Nelson's most glorious hour. With courage and valor, Nelson's fleet withstood the Spanish and the French. Nelson's strategy crippled the French fleet and secured British naval supremacy. But Nelson's greatest victory was the death of him. He was mortally wounded and died aboard his ship, the Victory. Trafalgar changed Napoleon's plans of conquest. In 1805, French Admiral Pierre de Villeneuve had been commanded by Napoleon to land troops in Naples to aid the French troops fighting in southern Italy. He encountered Nelson off Cape Trafalgar, and the battle began. Nelson divided his fleet into two squadrons that cut the French and Spanish fleet in two, enabling a brilliant victory. Nelson's fleet of 27 ships defeated a combined Spanish and French fleet of 33. 1,500 Englishmen were wounded or killed, but no ships were lost. 1,400 of Villeneuve's men were taken prisoner, and his fleet lost about 20 ships. The Battle of Trafalgar was the most important naval battle in the Napoleonic Wars because it ruined Napoleon's chances for naval conquest and made it impossible for Napoleon to invade England for the rest of his career. It established England as the monarch of the seas for the next 100 years. After the Battle of Trafalgar, Napoleon realized he could not successfully invade the island fortress of England. So what did he do next? In 1805, he decided to focus his attention on the coalition consisting of Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Naples. Napoleon's troops marched into Germany and forced the Austrians to surrender at the Battle of Ulm, fought within days of Trafalgar, which underscored that Napoleon ruled on land, although Great Britain dominated the seas. Next, Napoleon's army of 68,000 Frenchmen met the Russian army, led by Alexander I, and the Austrian army, led by Francis I of Austria, of 90,000 men at Austerlitz, where they fought a fierce battle. The Austrians and Russians suffered terrible casualties, and Napoleon's army emerged victorious. Austerlitz is considered one of Napoleon's greatest victories. As a result, the Third Coalition, Austria, Russia, and Britain, dissolved. Austria sued for peace, and Russian troops returned home. The French now controlled much territory in what is now Germany. In 1807, Alexander I of Russia signed a treaty, known as the Treaty of Tilsit, that in essence split control of Europe between Alexander and Napoleon and created an alliance between them. France now seemed invincible on land. Napoleon knew better than to attempt another overt military attack on Britain, but he could not just leave Britain alone. He devised a plan to ruin British commerce and the economy. This was Napoleon's continental system. Your younger children have not read about this in detail, but it's important to cover, especially as it affected the young United States. Napoleon hoped to ruin British commerce by blocking trade with Britain. Napoleon kept British ships out of European ports that he or his allies controlled, and he pressured neutral countries, like the U.S., to stop trading with England. The plan was brilliant, but not completely successful. England had such overwhelming naval superiority that the continental system stretched France too thin. It ultimately provoked Napoleon's calamitous invasion of Russia. That's getting a little ahead of the story, though. Napoleon attacked Russia in 1812, but he spent 4 years before that trying to conquer Spain and Portugal. The Peninsular War helped to end Napoleon's image of invincibility on land. From 1803 to 1813, Napoleon attempted to take over the Iberian Peninsula. He underestimated the ruggedness of the terrain, the lack of centralization in Spanish society, and the will of the Spanish people. Napoleon's attempts to reform the traditional institutions of the Catholic Church, like the Inquisition, fueled Spain's will to resist French control. Meanwhile, Napoleon's fragile truce with Russia was unraveling. Alexander I and Napoleon grew to despise each other more and more in the years between 1807 and 1812. In part, Napoleon's hostility towards Russia stemmed from his frustrations with England. He had tried unsuccessfully to subdue Britain, so he decided that if he defeated Russia, Britain must follow. We'll see this again a century later. Hitler followed the same path in 1941, with the same results. In December of 1810, Tsar Alexander withdrew from the continental system. Napoleon raised his Grande Armée of 600,000 men and marched into Russia in June of 1812. The Russians refused to engage him in any decisive battles, but they managed to snipe and picket his advancing armies. Napoleon marched ever deeper into the heart of Russia and finally attacked and burned Moscow. Then he waited for Alexander to surrender. No Russian surrender came, but the Russian winter did. By now it was October, and Napoleon had badly overextended his lines of supply. Without any reliable source of food or ammunition, he decided to retreat into the teeth of a Russian winter. Napoleon raced back to Paris by sled, but his men had to walk. When the last of them staggered home in December, barely 30,000 of his original 600,000 troops emerged from Russia, only 1 out of 20 men. After Napoleon's return from Moscow, Austria, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Sweden formed a new alliance. This time, for once, they did not quarrel or back out on each other. Incredibly, Napoleon raised a whole new French army of raw recruits, boys and old men, and took the offensive against the Allies. Though Napoleon won initial victories, he was vastly outnumbered by his combined foes. 15 months after his disastrous return from Moscow, Napoleon was beaten and exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. For any other man, that might have been the end of the story. But Napoleon plotted his escape and return to power. For what is called the 100 Days, it was really about 111, Napoleon ruled France and threatened Europe all over again. He marched into Belgium in an attempt to defeat the combined forces of Britain and Prussia at a spot called Waterloo. After his defeat there, Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, this time an island deep in the South Atlantic. To conclude, Napoleon is a larger-than-life figure. He strides across the stage of world history and provides an excellent opportunity to help your children see what Jesus meant in Matthew 16:26. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul?